The air on the Western Front in early December 1944 was thick with the scent of pine, snow, and the profound exhaustion of men who knew the war had likely been lost elsewhere. The Allies, confident after the liberation of France, were pushing toward the German border, buoyed by the belief the conflict would be over by Christmas. Yet, deep within the bunkers and command posts of the beleaguered Wehrmacht, a desperate, final counterstroke was being meticulously prepared, a secret operation that defied all rational military logic. This was Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, soon to be known to the world as the Battle of the Bulge. It was Adolf Hitler's final, grandiose attempt to resurrect the ghost of 1940's Blitzkrieg, a massive, armored thrust through the dense, snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, the very terrain where Germany had previously achieved its greatest tactical victories. For the German officer corps, it was less a battle plan and more an inescapable death warrant for the last remaining forces of the Reich. The genesis of the offensive lay entirely within the mind of Adolf Hitler, driven by an almost pathological denial of the military reality facing the Third Reich. Against the solemn counsel of almost every senior military professional, including Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, and the legendary Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, Hitler was obsessed with a single, impossible objective: to stab through the thinly held American lines, cross the Meuse River, and capture the vital Allied supply port of Antwerp. This success, he believed, would isolate the British and Canadian armies in the north, forcing a humiliating negotiated peace with the Western Allies and allowing Germany to shift its focus entirely to the Eastern Front. The planning sessions were agonizing. Von Rundstedt and Model argued vociferously for a more limited, achievable counteroffensive aimed at merely disrupting Allied supply lines and destroying localized forces. They proposed a small solution. Hitler dismissed them with contempt, labeling their caution as defeatism. His plan was a logistical and strategic fantasy, demanding a complete, operational reversal of the war in the West. Germany was critically short on fuel, armor, and manpower. The tanks assembled for the attack, including the last operable King Tiger units, often crewed by hastily trained youths, were literally scraping the bottom of the Wehrmacht's barrel. Yet, the core tenets of the plan were non-negotiable: absolute surprise, which required a complete radio silence and maximum secrecy, and the capture of Allied fuel depots to sustain the advance across the vast distance to Antwerp. The entire operation was cloaked under extraordinary secrecy, initially codenamed Operation Autumn Mist to conceal its true winter timing. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the critically important 5th Panzer Army, noted the plan's insane ambition but resigned himself to executing the Führer's will. This was not a sound military operation, but a colossal, existential gamble, a desperate, all-or-nothing lottery ticket purchased with the lives of Germany's last strategic reserves. The unspoken consensus among the general staff was that if this offensive failed, the West was lost forever. The element of surprise, the Blitzkrieg resurrected. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the illusion of peace shattered with a massive, localized artillery bombardment along an 85-mile front. The opening attack caught the Allies completely unprepared. The Ardennes sector had been chosen by the Americans as a ghost front, a quiet sector manned by green units, like the newly arrived 106th Infantry Division, or battle-weary troops recovering from earlier, brutal campaigns. The German forces, moving silently for weeks under the cover of thick forests, exploited several key factors with deadly efficiency. Weather cloak, heavy overcast skies, relentless snow, and freezing fog, the very weather Hitler had bet on, perfectly negated the massive superiority of the Allied air forces, which had been the single greatest fear for German ground forces since D-Day. Secrecy and deception. The operational secrecy was flawless, preventing any strategic warning. Furthermore, the elite operation, Operation Greif, commanded by the notorious SS Commando Otto Skorzeny, was launched. German commandos, disguised in captured American uniforms and vehicles, were sent ahead to sow chaos, change road signs, and capture key bridges over the Meuse. The resulting panic and rumors amplified the sense of Allied disarray far beyond the actual combat. Terrain funnels, the German armor rushed through the dense pine forests, initially creating panic and confusion among the scattered American defenders. The thin American lines were pierced and shattered, and the entire front bulged rapidly westward, creating the bulge that gave the battle its name. The initial hours were a staggering success for the Wehrmacht. American units were overrun, pockets of resistance were bypassed, and the entire front bulged rapidly westward. Reports flooding back to German command centers were jubilant. The Blitzkrieg lived. Commanders, skeptical just days earlier, suddenly saw a flicker of terrifying, desperate hope that the impossible might be achieved. The infamous events, such as the massacre of American prisoners at Malmedy by troops of the 1st SS Panzer Division, underscored the brutal, all-or-nothing nature of the attack, hardening the will of both sides. The logistical sledgehammer, traffic jams and the fuel crisis. Yet, almost immediately, the inherent, glaring flaws of the plan began to manifest, not on the battlefield, but in the logistics train. The very terrain that provided initial concealment soon became the greatest enemy. The Ardennes was crisscrossed by narrow, winding roads, designed for logging, not the simultaneous passage of hundreds of heavy tanks, assault guns, and supply vehicles. Traffic jams quickly materialized into impenetrable knots miles long, often freezing solid overnight. Commanders desperately tried to push logistics forward, only to find the entire advance halted by a single wrecked vehicle, a narrow bridge destroyed by American engineers, or simply the immense weight of the column itself. The German military term became Kesselplatz, or Cauldron Square, describing the hopeless congestion. Officers watched with mounting horror as hours, the precious, non-renewable commodity of the offensive, bled away. Fuel, the lifeblood of the offensive, became the paramount crisis. German planning relied entirely on capturing Allied fuel depots. These vital resources proved either non-existent in the advance path or heavily defended. General Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, the most successful spearhead, consistently overran its supply lines, pushing ahead of their fuel trucks. German tank crews were forced to cannibalize fuel from disabled vehicles, leaving them stranded mid-advance in the freezing cold. This logistical collapse immediately compromised the aggressive momentum of the elite panzer divisions. Key objectives, like the vital road junction at Bastogne, were defended by tenacious American units, most famously the 101st Airborne Division, whose desperate resistance consumed vital time and fuel the Germans simply could not spare. The advance was choking on its own ambition. The turning point, the sky opens up and the end of movement. The single, decisive turning point of the Battle of the Bulge came not from a massive armored clash, but from the heavens, confirming the worst fears of the German generals who had opposed the plan. Hitler's entire plan was predicated on the continuation of the miserable winter weather. He knew that if the clouds broke, the Allied air forces, with their unchallenged superiority, would return to dominate the skies and negate the advance. On the morning of December 23, 1944, after days of relentless snow and fog that had blinded the Allies, the clouds parted. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Allied air power, which had been grounded and dormant, roared into action. Thousands of aircraft, including the highly effective P-47 Thunderbolt and the nimble P-51 Mustang, descended upon the German supply columns. The German roads, already choked with stalled armor, became a vast, open-air slaughterhouse. The fuel tanks that were still moving were hit, the supply trucks were shredded, and the essential movement of infantry and ammunition was halted entirely. The German officer on the ground, who had felt invincible under the blanket of fog, was now exposed, helpless, and subjected to the same kind of overwhelming air dominance that had doomed the defense in Normandy. The German logistical spine was broken. Adding to the catastrophe, a last-ditch attempt by the Luftwaffe to launch a coordinated attack, Operation Bodenplatte, to clear the skies failed spectacularly, resulting in the irreplaceable loss of hundreds of fighter pilots, the last vestiges of German air superiority. By Christmas Day, the entire offensive had stalled short of the Meuse River, and the German generals knew the operation had failed. Collapse and consequence, the last roll of the dice. By early January 1945, the German counteroffensive was in reverse, slowly being squeezed back into the forests by converging American and British forces. The reserves Hitler had thrown into the Ardennes, the last cohesive armored forces remaining in the West, had been destroyed, rendered immobile by lack of fuel, or simply ground into dust by the relentless Allied artillery and air bombardment. The psychological blow was profound. The brief, Desperate hope that had fueled the German front lines throughout December turned into bitter resignation. The failure of the Ardennes offensive was total. Germany failed to capture any of its key strategic objectives. Crucially, it had expended its final strategic reserve of men, material, and, most critically, experienced junior leadership. These were the veteran non-commissioned officers and junior officers whose tactical brilliance had sustained the German army for 5 years. They were now casualties of a desperate delusion. When the Allies launched their counterattack, the German forces were too weak to resist effectively. The battle immediately and fatally drained Germany of the manpower and armor necessary to hold its lines on the Eastern Front, where the Soviets were already preparing their final, massive offensive. The gamble, born of a dictator's delusion, had cost Germany over 100,000 casualties. The German officers who survived emerged from the freezing forests knowing they had not only failed to win the war but had accelerated the final, inevitable defeat of the Reich by liquidating its last mobile strike force. The Western Front would never again see a large-scale German armored movement.